So true. I wish I had $1 for every time someone from a regional community said, I wish I had better internet speed and mobile data, but it is such a good point. Now, we don't have a lot of time for questions. We do have some though. Get your hand up and we'll get a microphone to you as soon as possible if you'd like to ask one. I might kick things off if that's all right. And Francis Chu, I found this interesting in you can pull that microphone towards you, that one next to you if you'd like. Looking at your picture of the Murray-Darling system of the pies of the amount of water allocated, showing a new chunk was going to the environment, but still the pie is the same size. It still gets allocated water. Irrigation still gets allocated water. There's still unallocated flows. That pie is still the same size. Is that a flaw, I suppose, in the basin plan looking at climate change if it's still trying to allocate the same amount of water every year and the climate is giving it less water year on year, and that changes?
So that pie you saw was, at the time the basin plan was actually done, was based on 114 years of historical record. And the stuff that you see in the pie, yeah, you got to base it on something, so they base it on 114 years of historical record. Now, the amount of water that you actually get every year is not necessarily the pie. It depends on how much water there is in the system, in the storages.
But no one's burning irrigation rights. There's still, that right still exists, and it's being just allocated to the environment instead of the irrigator.
That's correct. And how much water you get, as the license as Ben mentioned, depends on how much water there is in the storages.
Have we got a microphone out yet? Put your hand up if you'd like to ask a question. There's one down here as we're getting that down. Rob, I might just ask you this, and Chris, you can chime in if you'd like, but you mentioned the Indigenous communities and you touched on the ideas of making things easier for those communities in the north to be involved in this. What are sort of your key ideas to change that sort of status quo where they feel locked out of the development of irrigation or the development of properties in that area?
We should have to come up with another model, a better model for them to be involved in it and take ownership of it. And I believe the share farming type model, and I'm proposing one with them at the moment, and we've virtually signed off on it, to do a share farming deal so that the farmer comes in and develops it and they still own it, so they've got permanent ownership. So that's one. The other thing, I really believe that they can do a report on areas, on what they believe should happen in their traditional owned areas, whether it be on their own land or on other people's land where they have traditional ownership. And that report should have strength with government and with regulators rather than be ignored.
This question here.
Francis, you pointed to the Mediterranean as being a drying area in the drying climate, as with South America, Southern Australia, and Argentina, or South Africa. Sorry, but it wasn't clear whether California was also going to be hit in that same sort of northern sort of lateral sort of move, if it is. So, could you tell us about that, please?
Yeah, so Southern California is having the similar thing that we are seeing in the mid-latitudes in the southern hemisphere. It's not as clear as it is in where we are, and partly because in northern hemisphere there's a much bigger land mass, and they don't have the ocean systems like we do across in the south. But yes, certainly Southern California has been having quite a few droughts, and projections for the future are also indicating that they're likely to be drier, not as clear as it is in our part of the world.
And Ben Hazlett, we might bring you into that because these are the areas that compete with you in a lot of those areas. When you see that graphic showing drying in the Mediterranean, in South Africa, in the Chile region, in California, as well as what you're growing, drying in your area, does that give you hope of competing in those high value areas around the world?
I mean, I'm not concerned about California, obviously, because we're counter-seasonal to California, and in a lot of ways we had really great relations with them over a long time. The other southern regions, we already do compete with them, and I guess that brings me back to my emphasis on making sure we've got the technology we require, because they can outcompete us on cost of labour and a lot of their other inputs. And so that's why I think it's absolutely so critical that a large swath of our farmers have access and implement the technology we've got available. Some of it is already there, but I think our extension's fallen off rather poorly in the last 20 years with regard to making sure we get those things out to the people on the ground.
Is there any other questions out there? Put your hand up if you need.
I might chime in there. I think the knowledge is important. It's about knowing and planning planning for what might eventuate. And I think in the context of farming with water markets and so on, it's I think with Ben, in your area, it's really about certainty of knowing where you can get and how much you can pay for. Because if you know that, you can actually then start pricing that into the systems, because you need that much water. If you know you can always get that and how much you need to pay for that and so on, then you've got more rooms to move with it. So this is where I think that's where we need to move forward too. Yeah,
reliability and security are key.
And how much you need to pay for it, Yeah. Absolutely.
I've got a question up there.
I just have a question in regard to both the gentlemen on Western Australia. I think this hydro project, when you talked about ODE, I was just wondering, both the National Water Initiative as well as the Basin Plan actually are saying how floodplain harvesting is actually should be brought into the formal entitlements in terms of what's happening in the rest of the basin states, especially South Australia and New South Wales and Victoria. And I think you were proposing that in addition to what they have as entitlement, they should be using floodplain harvesting, but there could be difficulties in future in time trying to see what proportion of water they are using and what's the impact, both environmental and on the infrastructure. On the other hand, I think the other gentleman was talking about the difficulties with the regulatory system there. So I think in the context of ODE and Western Australia, that there is some thinking in terms of a new regulatory regime, if I remember right, with a new act. So I was just trying to understand, like, I'm sure you're aware of the difficulties of how floodplain harvesting is trying to be managed now in the southern states. So is there something which you have learned and how you can actually prevent some of those things happening in the north?
I don't know what's happening in the Murray-Darling other than it seems over-allocated, but sorry, Francis, but the demand currently in the Fitzroy is about 0.5% of the available water, I think. It's about 6 gigs, I think. So there's no current demand. There's also no water allocation plan, and the government's in the process of developing that at the moment and going through that consultation, which would include all of those aspects. So they're taking the hydrological models into it and the floodplain models and the hydrodynamic models and everything else in doing that. The initial allocation they're talking about is around 300 gigs of around about 1,600 gigs that would be available at that 20% flow. So but again, that's the current speculation that's gone out to the public. Government's going through quite a long process of consultation to do it, but there's very little demand at the moment. The ORD's different though, because it's regulated. Oh, sorry, it's got a dam.
And while we're just heading there, just carrying on from that, did you look exclusively with your work at the development of Northern Australia? Was that exclusive at providing water for agriculture, or did you look at other uses like for mining or for town dam water storages, etc.?
So not mining as much because the water use for mining is very low. So generally they'll get it themselves. We looked at aquaculture. There's an enormous opportunity for aquaculture and did a few case studies on that. An incredible return on megalitre. So dollar per megalitre is very high. Lots of challenges around getting it to markets and biosecurity issues, but it is very high opportunity, but also very high risk.
A question here?
Question for the panel, if I may. I'm a water broker from New South Wales, and I agree wholeheartedly with you, Ben. We have to be licensed, absolutely have to be. One of the problems that I see with that, though, is in the Murray-Darling Basin alone, we've got 3 state governments, potentially 4 with Queensland. And then we talk about the issues in Northern Australia as well. Does the panel think it's well and truly time that we started to look at water as a national issue rather than state by state, farmer by farmer, and started to talk about it sensibly?
Who would like to go first?
You go.
That sounds eminently sensible, but I think Australia's been arguing about that for over 100 years. So as a federation, I think it's a bit of a challenge. But yeah, it's a national resource. If we could manage it nationally, that would make a lot of sense. But I think there's, it's a bit of a tough battle, that one.
I'm not really sure that Western Australia is part of the nation.
Spoken like someone from the big state. Do we have another question up there? Yep.
Hi Warwick, it's Philip Glyde. I'm the Chief Executive of the Murray-Darling Basin Authority. Francis and the whole panel, thanks very much for a fantastic set of presentations. Francis depressed me, Ben excited me, but both of them were talking about the need to change the basin plan in the future to reflect the impacts of climate change, and Ben was talking about we've got to change a lot of the operations around water markets and things like that. I guess I'd be interested in any of the panel's views on what do we do in order to make sure that we can get the rate of change going that we'll need in order to meet the problems and the challenges the two of you have identified?
Take it away, Francis.
Yeah, I'll have a go at that. I think change is needed, change is certain, and change will come. We got to deal with some of these issues. So we got a plan. As you know, Phil, it's pretty hard to see you with a light shining
Under the
there.
spotlight, isn't it?
I know.
I hope it's not a halo.
It is too, yeah. So the basin plan, the basin plan is there. The basin plan is doing something. The basin plan is taking, 1/5 the water recovered for the environment. We got to give it time, and we got to get it to work, because it can't just work in 1 year. It depends on what kind of climate you see. Over time, we'll see that working. But we also got to sit down and think about, what the future might eventuate. I think the best we can do is really figuring out, at least knowing, given that the future is uncertain, at least knowing, under this particular future, what we might be able to do, under that particular future, what we might be able to do, and sit down and have that information in there, so that the people who are making decisions, whether it's the authority, whether it's the science people, whether it's the policy people, know which trajectory, under what trajectory, what outcome you might get. And then it is a risk-reward type decisions that politicians are used to making decisions with. You do A, and A doesn't eventuate, you might lose the money of actually, spending money unnecessarily, as opposed to if you didn't do something and something eventuate and you didn't transition to a better outcome, you would have to pay more in the future. And I think this knowledge, it's very important. The same thing, that's what we were just talking about, Ben, about what you want is a certainty or how you can actually manage your risk. And then you will go ahead and just manage your risk accordingly.
I think, Philip, there's a two-pronged attack. I think the first one is just getting the regulatory stuff right, which is hard, but it's that metering stuff, so we got that properly under control. Some of the rules and regs, like I said, about broking, so we can do those short-term and reasonably quickly, I'd hope. So there might need to be some incentive for some of the states to get on board with some of that. And then the second part of it is really information. If you've got good information as a producer, then you've got the opportunity to manage risk. When you don't understand all the bits and pieces at play, then it's tough to manage the risk. So I think it's a two-pronged thing.
And Ben, we might just stay with you for a second too. One of your big points was dollars per hectare being a driver for agriculture in your part of the world. Do you also worry though that driving that has been huge expansions to almonds, to table grapes, to citrus, things going quite well, and that putting pressure on the ability to get water to your part of the river system? And do you worry about overdevelopment then, meaning making it harder to get water on time when you need it as an irrigator at the lower end, as opposed to someone closer to the dams in the northeast of Victoria or New South Wales or something like that?
I mean, there's certainly challenges around and making sure that we can get the asset where it needs to be. I'm a bit nervous about saying that we should not develop this here or not develop that there. I think you've got to make sure, and that's something that Philip's more got the handle on, where the water flows, what the constrictions are. But as a nation, I think we should look at those. If you put an environmental hat on, I'd say that we should have all the development at the Murray mouth, because it meant the water flowed all the way down and we got maximum bang for the buck both ways. We know that's not going to work. I obviously am concerned about making sure that we've got access to the asset when we need it, but I think as a rule, I think we're pretty smart. I think we can do some infrastructure type work. I think we can do running the river type work, and I think in general terms I don't have any problem with any particular crop. I think it's an unwise government that says you should grow this here and that there, because I think what that does is it stifles innovation.
Do we have another question? Here we go, up the front here. We'll get that down to you nice and quick. There we go.
Hi guys, a question for the panel. I think it was to bring together the two threads with the northern and southern picture that we presented, and with the forecast that Francis showed us that that climate change might actually increase the volume of rain in northern Australia, and it was particularly honing in on that the decline in inflows over the next 40 years or so, I think it was, might equal the amount that's been recovered by the Murray-Darling Basin Plan. So my question is a very general one, but if you could comment on how irrigation can sustain its social licence to export the same volume of crop that it does at the moment, given, as Francis also showed, Australia is amongst the most intensive per capita water users in the world, with that disparity of forecasts under climate change for inflows in the north and the south of the country.
You want to? Well, I'd say social licence. I think our social consideration needs to be that we need to make sure we use that asset in the best way possible. So I think the industry as a whole will look to make sure they return as much as they can per megalitre, because they need to be able to make their businesses survive. So I'm not super concerned about that. Plus also we have an allocation system in place in the basin. If the water's not there, it's not going to get allocated. So there will be some challenges, but part of the Murray-Darling Basin Plan I think that we need to pay a lot of attention to is, as we go along, we need to monitor and make sure that we make changes that are necessary. That's why no plan's perfect when you write it, because you can't know every eventuality. So if we guessed too negatively, what we might have done is hamstrung industry so poorly that it just spiralled so that it didn't have critical mass. So I think it's really important to not jump the gun and use all the water in agriculture and not go too far the other way. I think a good plan is one that monitors and adjusts as it goes. But I think as far as social licence goes, as long as we use that water wisely, as long as we're trying to return as much as we possibly can from it, I think, and look after the environment, I think we've got our social licence.
And Francis Chu, do you want to talk about the disparity in the predictions? From
Yeah, I was just going to say with Mike, it's really adapting as you get more and more knowledge coming in, but you got to think about it, yeah? You got to think about how the future might eventuate, where you go, and as you get more and more knowledge, yeah, you adapt the plan accordingly. Yeah, I know, Warwick, you spoke about the North. So obviously, we've got to think as a nation, but I think you could argue they're independent issues. I mean, why not develop the North and the South? Or why not develop the South and North, or whatever, you know? So the South is the South, but people, we are there, we live there, how we can actually continue on. People are already living there and doing irrigation and all this other stuff. Yeah, what they will eventuate in the South. I mean, the North is a separate discussion about if there's actually potential to actually do more things there, well, go ahead and do it. But I think the North has to be more than an egg story. It has to be a larger story around where the nation wants to go. That's just one view.
The one thing that came out of that is that really the Murray-Darling Basin Plan is a plan, so you can monitor it, you can do something with it, and then you can go from there. There's no plan in the North, and no one's prepared to put their hand up and make a plan and say something. So that is our problem. If some rules were brought out, some decisions were made, then you could make progress. But while you're standing still and not doing anything, there's not much you can say.
Well, you've put a bow on that perfectly, Robert. Thank you very much for that. Can you please thank our panel, Francis Chu, Chris Chilcott, Robert Brossamer, Ben Hazlitt.